what we're going to be going over here is cost, volume, profit analysis, where we're going to be looking at alternative fixed costs versus variable cost structures here. So this is the problem that we're going to be going over here. Say we're a small retail business here and we're going to have to rent some space here to sell our product. And we're really going to be looking at three different options here we have on our rental agreement here. And what those options include here is we're going to be looking at our rental cost here based on some fixed fee here, some fixed fee that we're going to have to pay on a monthly basis, plus some percent of our revenues here or our sales. So we're going to look at these three different options here. So for option A, we're going to have a $2,000 fixed fee that we have to pay on a monthly basis, but we're not going to have to pay any percent of our revenues or our sales. But then moving down to option B, this is the case where we're only going to have to pay a $1,000 fixed fee, but we're going to have to, in addition to that, we're going to have to pay 12% of our revenues or our sales. And then option C, this is the case where we're going to have no fixed fee, but we're going to have to pay our entire amount of rent here based on 24% of our revenue. So you can see the different options here. For first, our option A here, our entire rent here is based on a fixed fee or a fixed cost here, $2,000. No percent of the revenues that we have to pay on that. But on option C here, we have no fixed cost. All of our rent here is going to be based on our revenues here, our total percent of our revenues here, 24%. So let's go and let's look at this down, looking at it in terms of a cost, volume, profit graph here. So showing on our x-axis here, those are our units sold, and then along our y-axis, that's our operating income. And I have it laid out here, each of those different options we have laid out on our profit volume line here. So for option A here, we're going to have a contribution margin on a per unit basis here of $20. So for each unit that we have in sales, $20 here is going to go towards operating income. We'll go through these numbers later and how we determine them. But then for option B here, a contribution margin is $14 per unit. Option C is $8 per unit. Now, if we go down on the other end here, where for fixed costs that we have here, for option A here, we have that fixed cost here of $2,000. So we'd have to cover those fixed costs here of $2,000 here before we start generating any positive operating income. And for option B, $1,000 here in fixed cost. And option C, $0 here in fixed cost or a fixed fee. So those are our three different options here, looking at them in terms of a cost, volume, profit line. So before we move on here, just to understand here, just looking at the steepness or the slope of our line here, option A has the steepest slope at $20 here per unit. So that's really, when we talk about slope here, that's really the change of Y here, our operating income, over the change of X here, our units sold. So you can see for option A here, $20 here in change in operating income based on one unit that we sold. So that's our slope here, $20 per unit. Now, we're going to look at it in terms of an inflection point here. We're based on our quantity that we've sold here of 170 units. That's going to equate to $1,400 here in operating income, and that's for all three options that we have. Same operating income we generate based on those 170 units that we have to sell here. So let's just go, and really what you're looking at here is everything is really based on those units that we sell, and of course the fixed costs that we have to cover, and those contribution margin per unit here. So looking at the case here where we have greater than 170 units in sales, and just pick out some point here. Let's just say we have higher sales here. Say they're around 250 units here. Just looking at the case here on and comparing, let's say, those 250 units that we sold, you can see option A here has by far the greater operating income here, just on looking at one specific on any specific number of units that we sold here. And option C here has the lowest operating income, with option B being somewhere in between. So that's just looking on one and picking out one constant number of units that we sell. And as you can see, the spread gets to be much wider here. The more units you sell, the option A here is got a greater spread here, is generating greater operating income than option C here, based on those fixed costs and that contribution per unit. And then looking at it in terms of just say the same operating income here, you can see that option A here, we have to sell fewer units here to generate the same operating income as option C. Option C, you have to sell a whole number more units here to generate the same operating income. So you can see what's going on here. So you really want to be keeping looking at it in terms of the units that you're selling here. So you got to really have some confidence here in the number of units you're selling. So again, option C, generate the same operating income. You have to sell a whole lot more units than option B. And option A. Option B is somewhere in between. But that's the case here where you have those higher units of sales here. So with option A, you're going to have the highest operating income when sales are high versus your other options. Option C, you're going to have the lowest operating income here when sales are high. But then if we look on the other side of that inflection point here, just the opposite is true. So let's look at the case here where let's just say we have, and let's just look at it in terms of our break-even point here. So for option A here, we got to cover those fixed costs here of $2,000 before we get start generating any positive operating income. Based on that contribution margin of $20 per unit, you're going to have a break-even point here of 100 units. So for just your break-even point alone here, option A, you're going to have to sell a whole lot more units here than your other two options. And just looking at your other options here, option B, you're going to have a break-even point here of 71 units based on the $1,000 here of fixed cost in dividing your contribution per unit of $14 in it. You're going to come up with approximately $71 here in break-even. Break-even point here, so you have to sell at 71 units here to break even with option B. In option C, well, you're not going to have to sell any units here for any break-even. It's got a zero break-even point because you have no fixed cost. So really, two things we want to look at here with that fixed cost here. Until you cover your fixed cost here, you're operating at a loss. You have a loss here. So you got to look at that break-even point here and look at any losses that you're going to have a loss up until you have your break-even point. So for option C here, you're not going to be generating. It's really risk adverse as far as losses. You're never going to have a loss here at option C, but you're generating less income here because of the facts that you have a lower contribution margin per unit. Option A here has the greatest possibility for highest risk for a loss if your sales are low. Option B, sort of in between. But then again, looking at, if we sell less than 170 units here, just again, making our comparison, whereas option A was the best option here. When you sold more than 170 units, you're generating a greater profit here. It's just the opposite here when you get below your inflection point here. So for option A here, you got that 100 units have to be sold here before you even break even, before you even start generating any positive income. And if you compare that to option C, well, at that 100 units of sales, option C is probably generating around 900 or 1,000 here in operating income, or a little under 1,000 here in operating income. And then looking at, in terms of just at that 100 unit sales here, then looking at it, just say at some constant operating income here, comparing option C with option A here, to generate the same operating income here. Again, option A, you have to have a whole lot more sales here to generate any operating income compared to option C. So option C, your sales here could be substantially less here than option A here to generate the same operating income. And option B is somewhere in between. Okay, so really what we're looking at here, you're looking at risk versus reward. So if you're taking a risk here by thinking that you can sell more than 170 units here, you're going to be rewarded here by going with option A here for that rental agreement versus option C or B. B is sort of in between. But if you're going to sell less than, you're thinking that you're going to sell less than 170 units, then option C becomes the better choice, because that is the lowest risk here. There is really no loss here with option C. If you don't sell any units, you're not having to pay any fixed cost or fixed fee. But those are just those are the things you want to look at. You just want to look at comparing at any point here. You want to look at the comparison between your different options based on some specific operating income that you're looking at. And then just in the opposite case here, you want to look at the, first off, is a comparison between the number of units that you have to sell to generate a specific operating income. And then you want to look at the case here where at a specific number of units sale, you want to look at the difference between the different options you have to generate greater operating income. And then just remember, when you're working with these fixed costs here, when you're trading off your fixed and your variable costs, you do have to be concerned here. Are any losses that you'd be looking at? Greater fixed cost here, you're going to have a greater chance of loss up until you get that break-even point. And in this case, the break-even point here, again, in quantities, we'd have to sell quite a few more here with option A here than really option B. Option B, we had break-even point here, 71 units. Okay, so that's basically what we'd have to look at here when you're looking at your different options based on the cost volume profit analysis. Now let's go over and let's look at how we came up with these numbers here. Okay, so here we'll start with our operating income equation here. This is the case here where we have to determine our operating income here, and that's based on your selling price minus your variable cost here times whatever quantity you sell. But then whatever that quantity is, you have to subtract out your fixed costs. In this case, it's that fixed fee. And then when we're talking about that contribution margin on a per unit basis, that's our selling price minus our variable cost. But in our case here, we had that variable cost was really broken down into two components here. In our selling, so what we're looking at here as far as our, well, let's start our selling price, that's showing as our selling price here, minus our variable cost. Well, our selling price was $50 per unit here. Our variable cost for all three options is going to be $30 per unit, but we have to add into that variable fee. So that's the extra amount here of variable cost that we have to look at. We're going to, for all three options, our variable cost here is going to be 30. The fixed portion of the variable cost is $30, but then that a variable fee, that's going to be based on our selling price here on a per unit basis. The selling price here is $50 per unit times that percent of fee that we have to pay in revenues. That's on a per unit basis. Okay, so that's the formula that we're working with. So for our rental agreement options, let's just look at how we calculated that contribution margin on a per unit basis. So we have our sales price here, $50 per unit. Variable cost here, $30 per unit. That's the case here for all three options. Then we have to subtract out that variable fee. That's going to equal our contribution margin per unit. So going through each of our options. So for option A here, we have 0% here of our revenues times, and again, this is on a per unit basis here, that $50 here selling price. That's the difference here. That works out to $20 per unit. Then if we move down to option B here, that was that 12% here of our revenues that are sales that we have to make times those $50 per unit here. That equates to $14 per unit. And then if we go down to option C here, that was that 24% of our sales here times the $50 here, subtracting that from our contribution margin here. We're going to come up with $8 per unit if you do the arithmetic on it. Now, looking at our example here, just understand how we got our operating income, how we determine that $1,400 here. And let's just look at go through all three of our options here. So what you're doing is you're just taking your contribution margin, whatever that is, times your unit of sales, and then you have to subtract out your fixed costs. So for looking at this $1,400 in operating income for 170 units sold for all three cases here, starting out with option C here, $8 per unit. I'm rounded everything off into even numbers here. So just you can do the arithmetic, but I just rounded them off into sort of even numbers here, so easy to look at. So just looking at our $1,400, maybe that's the easiest. So taking $8, option C, $8 per unit times 170 units, that's going to give us $1,400. We have no fixed costs that we have to cover here at option C. So that total amount here from 0 to 1,400, that's based on a contribution margin times the units, but we don't have to subtract out any fixed costs to determine our operating income. But moving up to option B, $14 here per contribution per unit times 170 units, and that's going to give us what? Around, well, again, it's $1,400 here looking at the 170 units, but we had to cover that $1,000 here in fixed costs. So $8 times 170, we're coming up with about $2,400, but we have to subtract out $1,000 here in fixed cost. That gave us the $1,400 here. Now if we move up to A, option A here, $20 per unit times 170 units, that equals to what? About $3,400, but we have to subtract out a $2,000 here in fixed fee or fixed cost from the $3,400 to get us up to $1,400 here. So that's just the mechanics here to determine your operating income, and we just use it here just looking at it in those terms. Contribution margin times your number of units sold, subtract out your fixed cost to determine your operating income. Now if we look at the case here where we actually have sold, let's say 255 units, we can go through the math here. So this is the case where we're getting rewarded here if we choose option A here, because we're going to have a greater profit here based on our profit line here. So just going through all the numbers, if we do that here for, let's just go through C here, for example, 255 units here times $8 per unit, we're going to come up with approximately 21 here and 2,100 in operating income. We don't have to cover any fixed costs, so everything went into operating income. Option B here, $14 here per unit times 255, or $14 here of contribution margin per unit times 255 units, we're going to come up with 2,600. But that's really subtracted. We'd have about 3,600 if you're just looking at the contribution times the number of units here, but we have to cover that $1,000 here in fixed cost, so that just brings us up to 2,600 here. Probably 3,600 overall, but subtract out your $1,000 here in fixed cost, then you got operating income here of 2,600. And if you move up here to option A here, $20 contribution margin times 255 units, it's going to yield 3,100 in operating income. But this is where we had probably 5,100 overall, but we have to subtract out that 2,000 here in fixed cost, so we get 3,100 here in operating income. Okay, so the point is here, by looking at where option A becomes the better choice here when you're selling more than beyond that inflection point here of 170 units, option A becomes the better choice here. You can see by our changes here in our operating income. If you just compare it to the 1,400 here, where all options were the same, looking at 255 units sold, option C here generates 50% more here in operating income. Option B, 85% here more in operating income. And option A here, 122% more in operating income. That's the only point you want to make here when you do your comparison between that inflection point here. So when you have higher sales here, option A becomes the better choice. But the opposite would be true here if we had less than 170 units. We don't have to go through all the arithmetic on it, but you can see that here. So if the sales are below 170 units, option A would have the lowest operating income, but it also has the possibility for the highest loss here. So remember, you don't want to run any losses here. Option A is all, if you sell more or less than that 170 units here, you're going to have, up until the point here where you start generating losses here, you're going to have option A here is generating less operating income than option C here. Okay, so that's the only point you want to make here. You have to have some confidence here in choosing you have to have some confidence level in the demand that you're looking at. So everything is demand driven here when you're looking at profits here and losses here. Okay, so that's about it here. But just remember here, just on when we had this less than 170 units here, just you understand that option A becomes not the best choice. It becomes actually the worst choice, because you're generating, even if you're generating some profit here, option A is always generating less profit here than option C, or operating income. And again, just remember, we just threw it in here. Option B is sort of in between here, between both of them. So if you're not so sure on your risk and rewards here, if you don't want to take a big risk here to generate greater operating income by choosing option A, and you want to maybe generate more income here than using option C, you might go with option B here. So that option B is sort of the middle of the road that you'd have to make. But those are typical choices that you're going to have to make here, and when you're making those comparisons here, when you cost, volume, profit comparisons. Okay, so that'll about summarize our topic.